By the end of this day, one of history's most powerful men would be gone. The emperor who had conquered most of Europe, who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, who had rewritten the map of nations, would draw his final breath on a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But 24 hours earlier, on May 4, 1821, the inevitable end was not yet written. Napoleon Bonaparte was still alive, still conscious, still aware of the world around him, however dimly. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of France, who had marched into Moscow, who had escaped from Elba and rallied an army in 100 days, now lay confined to a damp house on Saint Helena. 6 years of exile had reduced him. Illness had weakened him. But he was still Napoleon. At this moment, in the early hours of May 4th, the sequence of events that would lead to his death had already begun. His body was failing. His organs were shutting down. The symptoms had been building for months, ignored by some, misunderstood by others. The doctors on the island disagreed about the cause. His attendants watched helplessly as the man they had followed across battlefields grew weaker each day. This is not a story of glory. This is not a retelling of Austerlitz or Waterloo. This is the reconstruction of something far more universal. The last day of a life. No matter how extraordinary that life had been, it ended the same way all lives end. With time running out. With people watching. With words left unspoken and questions unanswered. What happened in those final 24 hours? What did Napoleon say? What did he feel? Who was with him? And what were the precise moments that marked the transition from life to death? This was May 4th, 1821. Saint Helena. Longwood House. 24 hours remained. This is day falling. To understand why this day matters, you must first understand where Napoleon was, and how he got there. By May 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte had been in exile on Saint Helena for nearly 6 years. The island sat in the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the nearest landmass. It was chosen specifically because escape would be impossible. After his defeat at Waterloo in June 1815, the British government decided that exile to Elba had been too lenient. Napoleon had escaped once. He would not escape again. Saint Helena became his prison. A volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. Remote. Isolated. Guarded. He lived at Longwood House, a damp and poorly ventilated estate on the island's windswept plateau. The conditions were harsh. The climate was unforgiving. Napoleon, who had once occupied palaces across Europe, now lived in cramped quarters under constant British surveillance. He was 46 years old when he arrived. By May 1821, he was 51. But he looked much older. Exile had aged him. Illness had ravaged him. The man who had once commanded armies now struggled to walk across a room. At this point in history, Napoleon was no longer a threat. His empire was gone. His armies were disbanded. His allies had moved on. Europe had reshaped itself without him. The Congress of Vienna had redrawn borders. Louis XVIII sat on the French throne. To the world, Napoleon was a relic. A former emperor living out his final years in obscurity. But his death would still matter. It would mark the definitive end of an era. The Napoleonic Wars had reshaped Europe. Millions had died. Kingdoms had fallen. Laws had been rewritten. And the man at the center of it all was about to die on a forgotten island. The world did not yet know. But in 24 hours, they would. This was not just the end of a man. This was the closing of a chapter in human history. May 4th, 1821. Morning. Longwood House. Napoleon woke sometime around 6 in the morning. He had slept poorly. He had been sleeping poorly for weeks. The pain in his abdomen had become constant. His attendants reported that he groaned during the night. His valet, Louis Marchand, was the first to enter the room. He found Napoleon awake but visibly weakened. The routine began as it always did. Marchand helped him sit up. Napoleon asked for water. His voice was faint. He complained of nausea. This was not new. For months, Napoleon had been unable to keep food down. He had lost significant weight. His face had become gaunt. His once robust frame had withered. Marchand opened the curtains. The weather outside was overcast, typical for Saint Helena in May. The dampness in the house was oppressive. Napoleon had complained about it repeatedly over the years. British officials had dismissed his concerns. At around 7 in the morning, Dr. Francesco Antimarchi arrived. Antimarchi had been Napoleon's physician since 1819. He was Corsican, like Napoleon. He had been sent by Napoleon's family to provide medical care. But his relationship with Napoleon was complicated. Napoleon did not fully trust him. Antimarchi examined him briefly. He noted the pallor, the weakness, the abdominal distension. He suggested that Napoleon try to eat something light. Napoleon refused. He had no appetite. By 8 in the morning, a small group had gathered in the adjacent room. These were the people who remained loyal. Count Bertrand, General Montholon, the Countess Montholon, Marchand, a few others. They spoke in hushed tones. They knew Napoleon was declining, but no one yet believed the end was imminent. At this point, Napoleon was still able to speak, still able to give instructions, still mentally present, though physically failing. He asked for his papers to be organized. He mentioned his will. He wanted certain items distributed to specific people. These details seemed mundane at the time. In hindsight, they would prove significant. By late morning, Napoleon's condition had visibly deteriorated. The pain intensified. He asked to be moved from his bed to a camp cot that had been set up in the room. He believed the smaller cot would be more comfortable. Marchand and Montholon assisted him. The transfer was difficult. Napoleon could barely support his own weight. Once on the cot, he lay still for several minutes, breathing heavily. At around 10 in the morning, he requested that someone read to him. This had become a ritual in recent weeks. When the pain was too great to sleep, he asked for distraction. Montholon selected a book. He began reading aloud. Napoleon listened, eyes closed. But within minutes, he interrupted. The words were not registering. His mind was elsewhere. He asked Montholon to stop. The room fell silent. Dr. Antimarchi returned shortly before noon. He observed that Napoleon's pulse was weak and irregular. His skin was cold to the touch. Antimarchi suggested administering calomel, a mercury-based medication commonly used at the time. Napoleon refused. He had taken it before. It had made him worse. He told Antimarchi he wanted no more treatments. This moment is significant. Napoleon, who had spent his life making decisive strategic choices, was now making his final medical decision. He would let nature take its course. At the time, no one fully grasped the implications. Around midday, Napoleon asked for wine mixed with water. It was brought to him. He took a few sips, then pushed it away. The nausea returned. He vomited. Marchand cleaned him. The attendants exchanged glances. They had seen this pattern before, but it was worsening. By early afternoon, Napoleon's speech had become less coherent. He muttered phrases in French and Italian. Some words were clear, others were not. He mentioned Josephine, his first wife. He mentioned his son, whom he had not seen in years. He mentioned battlefields whose names his attendants recognized. At this point, roughly 12 hours remained. By mid-afternoon on May 4th, the atmosphere at Longwood House had shifted. What had been concern was now becoming dread. Napoleon's breathing had changed. It was labored, irregular. His attendants could hear it from across the room. Dr. Antimarchi remained present, though there was little he could do. He monitored Napoleon's pulse. He noted the declining vital signs in his journal. He observed that Napoleon's extremities were growing colder. The body was shutting down. Around 3 in the afternoon, British officials were notified that Napoleon's condition had worsened significantly. Governor Hudson Lowe, who had overseen Napoleon's captivity for years, was informed. He did not visit. Their relationship had been hostile. Lowe had enforced strict rules. Napoleon had resented every restriction. Even now, at the end, that tension remained. Inside the house, Napoleon drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he occasionally spoke. His words were fragmented. He mentioned France. He mentioned the army. At one point, he said the word tête repeatedly. His attendants believed he was describing the pain. Marchand stayed close. He wiped Napoleon's forehead with a damp cloth. He adjusted the blankets. He ensured Napoleon was as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. By evening, around 6, Napoleon's lucidity had almost entirely faded. He no longer responded to questions. His eyes remained closed. His breathing continued, but it was shallow. The attendants took turns keeping watch. Count Bertrand sat in a chair near the cot. Montholon stood by the window. The Countess Montholon prayed quietly in the corner. Antimarchi checked Napoleon's pulse again. It was faint. The doctor knew what was coming. He had seen death before. This was the final descent. Outside, the sun was setting over Saint Helena. The wind picked up. The island was silent except for the sound of the ocean in the distance. Inside Longwood House, time was running out. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had shaped the fate of nations, had less than 6 hours left to live. The final hours were marked by silence. Napoleon no longer spoke. His breathing grew fainter with each passing hour. By 9 in the evening, those gathered in the room understood that death was imminent. Marchand remained at his side. Bertrand held Napoleon's hand. Montholon stood watch. Antimarchi monitored the vital signs, though there was nothing left to do. The room was lit by candlelight. The shadows flickered against the walls. Outside, a storm had begun. Rain fell steadily. The wind howled. Inside, the only sound was Napoleon's labored breath. Around midnight, his breathing became even more irregular. Long pauses between breaths. Then shallow gasps. His body convulsed slightly. His attendants leaned closer. At approximately 10 minutes before 6 in the evening on May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte drew his final breath. There was no dramatic final statement. No grand proclamation. Just silence. Marchand closed Napoleon's eyes. Antimarchi recorded the time of death. Bertrand wept quietly. The others stood in stunned stillness. The man who had dominated Europe for 2 decades was gone. Within hours, British officials arrived to confirm the death. An autopsy was performed the following day. The doctors disagreed on the cause. Some said stomach cancer. Others suggested arsenic poisoning. The debate would continue for centuries. Napoleon's body was placed in a coffin and buried on Saint Helena, near a spring he had liked to visit. His remains would stay there for nearly 20 years before being returned to France in 1840. News of his death spread slowly. It took weeks for the information to reach Europe. When it did, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, others mourned. But everyone understood. An era had ended. Napoleon had reshaped laws, borders, and governments. His influence would outlast him by generations. This was day falling. One day, everything changes.